difference in terms of the settlement that was done with the Germans, who paid $65 billion in reparations to victims. And the peace deal that was made with Japan and allowed them to pay exactly nothing and get away with the murder of millions of people. I'm wondering if anybody could explain. Perhaps you could talk about international politics to explain that big difference.
Absolutely. It's the comparison between Germany and Japan. It is it's a very good question. Again, it is a long discussion. But very briefly, yes, it's a lot to do with post-war politics. We all know about the Cold War, the role of the United States, and after the war, it's a big difference because of the change in the international political environment. China became a communist country in 1949, and it is very important. It is the polarization between communism and also the Western world getting more intense. And so Japan at that time, instead of an enemy of the United States, they see it, Japan can be a good ally. Given also the situation that Japan, after the war actually was, the United States actually was the leading the allies to restructure Japan at that time. So they have the power. And from then, Japan was, there's a shift in the political relationships. China, instead of ally, turns to be an enemy. So this shift actually provide Japan a strong support. Not just that they can continue the denial, but a lot of these war criminals, they can be absolved from the trials, from prosecution. One very distinct example is the human exploitation, Unit 731, that all of those who are supposed to be Class A war criminal, they are all absolved because the results that have been done in this particular setup in China, called Unit 731, all results went to the United States. And if you go to the National Congress, and you can still look at the declassified files, they are all translated into English from Japanese. So we can, from this example, we can understand this is, yes, very political. Yes.
Well, it actually, in the whole course of my work with the comfort living issue, first thing when someone asks me, why are you doing this work about music and sexual slavery, they say, huh? What does that have to do with anything, you know? But as soon as I bring up African American slavery and basically the whole story of the exploitation of Africa for human labor over the course of all those many centuries, people say, oh, music and slavery. I understand, you know. I think it's a very difficult question. I think that there is a tremendous amount of work to be done to understand the systemic relationships between all these different kinds of slavery. I think there has been a global kind of masculinization of the way that people think about slavery in general, and there's very little space for thinking about so if you close your eyes and you hear slavery, or if you watch Roots, or if you watch any of these number of different kind of canonical historical works about, you know, literary works about slavery, or films or whatever, oftentimes mostly what you're seeing is men being slaves. So one way of making these connections, I think, is to think about the ongoing story of sex trafficking, and as to think of African American slavery as inaugurating this whole colonial global network for the exploitation of women. I think that might be one thing.
Hi. It's been mentioned from people in the panel that there are, I guess, acts of Japanese activism as well, like in support of the comfort women. I was just hoping you could speak to that. I teach as an ESL teacher here in Toronto, and I get months upon months of Japanese students who come. And every time I just passively maybe mention this topic, you can imagine there are these like, hello? You've never heard this before. And it's the Korean students who'll be sitting in the back fuming, going, how could you not know your own history? Well, aside from Yoshiaki, I believe you wrote a book in 2007, I don't know what resources to point them towards. Did anybody? So I'm just wondering, where do I point my Japanese students to? What resources online or groups, what names do I get them to pay attention to?
Actually, it's not just Japanese students. Even when we talk to some Chinese students, they don't even know because there's lack of such information. But we are producing a lot of different resources. I think if you can stay behind, and we can share with you a lot more resources for teachers. Actually, Alpha, if we have educators here, you can check our website, and we have produced in the past years and ongoing teacher resources for teachers and for high school students. So we do have some samples of a study guide for a book called The Rape of Nanking, written by Iris Cheng. It's a study guide, so English teacher can use the study guide. And we are developing a brand new teacher's resource guide talking about the Asia-Pacific War from beginning to contemporary. The last chapter, we name it Peace and Reconciliation. So I think this is the most important thing for understanding critically the entire history of Asia-Pacific War. So please stay, we will talk with you.
Can I make a quick, I'll try to be quick. In response to a few of the questions, the question about linking between sexual slavery, the colonization that happened by the Japanese in Asia, to other forms of colonization and slavery, I think is a really important one that Mary raised, and I don't think I can do it justice, but I wanted to say a couple of things. And one thing that comes back to the first question about why Japan didn't have to pay reparations, because I think we have to talk also about the racism inherent in colonization and the victors of war getting to determine who were the victims on different sides. And so part of what my re-education happened that when I was living in East Asia is I didn't know actually that Korea had been colonized and then Taiwan. And I didn't know really anything about what had happened other than Pearl Harbor and the atomic bombs in Asia. And so this question about the tacit acceptance and how normalized colonization was, and how colonized bodies, both male and female, were not viewed as important in the global context. That is still true. And so understanding the links between different forms of colonialism and neocolonialism and how that renders people into a position of having no power. And so these colonial regimes carried those dominant ideologies, right, and continue to carry them. And so this is why it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to tackle these issues, because if you recognize colonialism as a crime in another context, then you have to recognize your own crimes of colonization and mobilization of people as labor and so on. And so how and when reparations are paid or not paid, when it's recognized, is a really tricky question, and that's why I think these links are so important. And I want to add into the dialogue to say that as a Canadian growing up here of European descent who went through the school system, I also didn't know about residential schools. And so when you say, Japanese people often will say, did this happen? Which when I was a teacher and amongst my Japanese friends certainly have had that experience. You could say the same thing in our context. Residential schools, what? What were those? And this legacy of silence around all of these issues interlinks them in a way that I think we need to push that analysis forward. And so it's really important that we're here talking about in Holocaust Education Week this issue, and why I'm trying to raise a few of these other issues that I think need to be linked to that.
What are the legible solutions there so we can help them? Is that just what they're wanting, what they're looking for, just a sincere apology, or is there anything else, any other solutions?
I'll just say something about that very quickly. I think we very much have a tendency to say the comfort women survivors, and to think that there is one single political opinion out there about it, and also to think that perhaps our political opinions should educate, comfort women survivors who in many cases were poor and didn't go through any kind of formal education or something like that. But from my experience, first of all, comfort women survivors have more first-hand experience of what we're talking about than any of the rest of us, and also more profound transnational experiences. Oftentimes are multilingual. Oftentimes have really met the people who oftentimes we just say the Japanese, but for comfort women survivors, they have particular Japanese people in mind. They know about the whole history of Japanese activism, which was very important in bringing the comfort women issue out in the first place. In my encounter, my book is just about three survivors that had radically different, opinions about what would count to them as reconciliation. Petronii, who sang the Ariran song towards the end, thought that for better or worse, in 1965, the reconciliation of international relations between Korea and Japan, and the giant financial settlement that happened then, she thought that counted as the financial side of things, but she wanted a verbal apology, or a written apology, I should say. Pakduri could have cared less about, as you can tell, the woman with the cigarette, could care less about any kind of formal apology, written apology, anything. She wanted the money, man, because she had kids and grandkids, and she wanted to give that to the. And so anyway, there's this tremendous diversity of very educated, actually, opinions, among survivors about what should happen, which we know almost nothing about. So my personal opinion is that the first thing that needs to happen is a whole lot of listening. So thank you.
I can just add really briefly that I think also there's a perspective that has to be taken into account of what is required from a government in terms of beginning the process of making reconciliation even possible. And so you'll often hear that the Japanese government has already apologized, or partly apologized in this Kono statement that was referred to earlier that they're trying to rescind. But as part of the understanding in international law and human rights law, the right to reparation, there are a whole bunch of conditions that need to be met. But one of them is that through the organ of the state, an official apology has to be made that starts the process of even recognizing that a crime was committed. And so, although you're very, I spent a lot of time with the women, and they criticize each other for their opinions on things, and some feel money would really make their lives better, and so on and so forth. But from this sort of structural perspective, I just wanted to add that apology is really important. And it's not enough for one government minister just to make an apology, but that there's an entire process that it has to go through to start that recognition. And I still hope to see that would happen. I foolishly continue to hope that, even though the government in Japan keeps moving back.
Among the survivors that I met, well, not just the Kamba women, but also many other atrocities, there's one thing in common. They all want us to share their stories. They thought that people are not listening. They feel hurt, actually. Some people even deny. The most hurting thing is when they heard that the Japanese government is denying. It's like a second rape, as Iris Cheng said. Denial is a second rape. So they always told us, please tell the story to especially the young people. So if you want to help, I think the most important thing is to share their stories. And another thing that they requested us to do is to make sure that the young generation knows about this, and that they don't have to suffer the same thing that we suffered. So it is among most of the survivors. Apology, yes, they really want to, but some of them, they know that they won't be able to get the apology, at their lifetime. But, a lot of them even holding my hands, telling me, please share my story, and trust me, this is a true story. This is very heartbreaking, actually. There are quite a number of lawsuits in the Japanese court, but some of the cases they won in the district court, but none of them won in the final Supreme Court or the High Court. All have been defeated. None of them won. So not just the comfort women issue, but also forced labor. The chemical weapons, the use of chemical weapons, they have quite a number. But they use the excuse, mostly Japan, the excuse that they use, quite a number of them. One is that they said there's a treaty signed. In 1951, there's a San Francisco Peace Treaty signed between the Ally and Japan, without China and Korea. Both these two victimized countries are not among the signatories. So Japan used this, because in this treaty, Japan was absolved of any reparation. And also another argument that they use is there's a joint committee and also some treaty between China and Japan and also Korea and Japan. Because after the war, both China and Korea, they were very, very poor. And they had to rely on the economic support of Japan. So somehow in the 70s and 60s, late 60s, they signed treaties. But it's argument as well, because China said that it is just on the state level, but not on civil rights. So that's the argument, but with all these excuses, none of the cases won in any of the Japanese court cases. So the one that Diana mentioned is not about the lawsuit against the government, it's just about it's a libel. So it's quite different.
But have any lawsuits been had in Korea itself? Because there are Japanese assets in Korea. It's the way the Japanese assets in the Philippines and China. So it seems to me it's a better place to go at it, because they may actually win in high courts. It's been very effective in the United States to go after assets in countries that have assets.
I can't speak in a completely educated manner on that, whether that's been attempted, and I don't know if anybody else on the panel can, but in 1965, when South Korea and Japan had signed a normalization treaty and began a diplomatic relationship again, a chunk of money, ostensibly for development, that was not called reparations, was given over at the time. But I just want to come back again to this point about, that has been something actually that's been very difficult for the women to get the support of their own government. First of all, because they weren't recognized as victims. Korean men who were forced laborers also were not recognized as victims at the end of the war by the Allied powers. They weren't recognized even in their own context. And so when money is given between governments, we're still talking about structures of power that may not recognize the experiences of individuals and groups of people who are marginalized in the society. And so I think back to one of the survivors who told me that when they asked a Korean politician, well, what did you do with all that money that the Japanese government gave you? Why didn't you give it to us? Why didn't you give it to the victims of forced labor and comfort women and so on? And he said, well, I'm sorry, Grandma, but we had to build roads. We had other things that we had to do with the money. And so even when reparations or funds, it gets to be very complicated, right? And so in the South Korean context, for a long time, the government said they couldn't really do anything because of that normalization treaty, but some activists actually went to court to hold their own government responsible for advocating on behalf of the comfort women. And so that's something that the South Korean government very recently has only been forced to do, I think, because of the movement in large part. I don't know if you want to add to that or if you know about any other cases.
Actually, yeah, I don't know about the going after Japanese assets in different places. I mean, because for so long you didn't have these diplomatic relationships, and so. But anyway, that's an excellent question, and we should all actually know about that. But I think we would know about it if it had been done. Sure.
There have been many lawsuits in Japan. The facts have been proven in court after a very rigorous legal process. So Japan cannot deny, and Japanese cannot deny, Japan government cannot deny what had happened during World War II, because there have been so many lawsuits in Japan, and some of them actually were raised by Japanese activists themselves. And so they have been proven in court that this did happen. But on the other hand, about compensation. So there have been various excuses, as Fora explained, that after the lawsuit went to the High Court or the Supreme Court of Japan, they were all defeated because of various international treaties. Now, lawsuits have been raised in California. So American veterans who were used as slave labor in POW camps, they sued Japanese companies, and they won in low courts. But when the lawsuit went to the High Court, to the Supreme Court, they were defeated because of the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty. So it is because of the treaty that it overrides the domestic laws in this regard.
Thank you, and we just have one last question from this gentleman who's waiting very, very patiently.
That's fine. A couple of observations. In my own lengthy human rights work, I'm always encouraging audiences to stop working in cycles and to make connections. So I was particularly delighted that you folks on the panel broadened this evening's already diverse and broad topic and put it in a broader human rights context, talked about colonialism and made those kind of connections, because I think they're important. Secondly, I want to commend the organizers of this week for broadening their agenda to include this topic in the first place. And I would wish that they would broaden this week even further. When I asked the New Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg their notions about genocide and Holocaust, I was pleasantly surprised by their answer that the museum will focus on 5 genocides, not just one. In Toronto, it's very frequently the case that events in this city focus only on the Jewish Holocaust, which is important. But there have been way too many others in this world. And those horrors need to receive attention as well. And just as I'm glad that tonight's panel made connections beyond this already diverse topic, I would hope that the organizers of this week would do more to broaden their thinking and include the information in sessions about other Holocausts, which I know occasionally they do, but not really enough.
If I can just say really briefly to that, last year I went with Tiffany, whose film trailer you saw, to Bergen County, New Jersey, where we went for the inauguration of a memorial to the Comfort Women. And I don't know if any of you have been there, but in front of the courthouse they have a memorial space, and the plaque to the Comfort Women, the funds for which were raised mostly by the local Korean American community, was put in place with a series of other plaques that have recognized other acts of genocide that have been committed elsewhere in the world. And so various communities raised funds, the funds weren't provided by the state, to put these plaques and create this commemorative garden together. So there was a placard recognizing African slavery and how many people died on the Middle Passage on the way over, Armenian genocide, the Irish potato famine. And so this beautiful public space, this garden, has actually become a teaching space and memorialization, linking different genocides. And so I think that that's also something that we could think about here in Toronto in terms of how we memorialize in the public space. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Judy Cho, Program Director of Toronto IFA. On behalf of all the IFA members and staff here, I'd like to thank all the facilitators, Josh, and the panelists, and especially Leah, for sharing their heartfelt stories. So what we're trying to do today was, through your personal stories, through the songs that grandmas sing, and understand the legacy of that grandma's going through, and how important arts plays a role in our society to understand this history and to make a connection in the human rights issues. And also doing so through the, not the least, doing through the education. But what we're trying to do is each individual's work is very, very important. But however, without the collaboration, we cannot go make a single language, what Joshua was talking about earlier. So what we're trying to do is trying to make a possible single language for the grandmas, all the victims of the war, to have some kind of closure. So thank you so much for being part of this movement, despite that we are delayed quite a bit. We have some books sharing. And everybody got the survey, so please fill out the survey and then pass it to the Joy. And we have some snacks, so please, we still have this room for quite a bit, so stay and ask some questions. Each one of us, including myself, we can share the stories for hours and hours all night. So please ask some questions, and we are here to answer your questions. Thank you so much.